So here we are. We are still going through our summer series called What's in Your Hand. And to introduce today's theme, we're going to do a little quiz. We did this in church on Sunday, so I'm hoping that you guys are up for it. If you're on your own, then just yell at the TV the answer. Perhaps if you're with other people watching this, then do it as a little competition between you. But let's see if you can work out what we're going to be talking about today by answering some of these questions. Question number 1. Which British band sang a song called Clocks? Which British band played a song called Clocks? Number 2. What time did Cinderella lose her glass slipper? What time did Cinderella lose her glass slipper? Number 3. Psalm 81 reminds us that, and you need to fill in the blanks, better is something in your courts than 1,000 elsewhere. Better is in your courts than 1,000 elsewhere. And number 4. In Esther 4, Esther is reminded that she was born for what? That she was born for what? And finally, question number 5. There are two words for time in Greek. One begins with a K and one begins with a ch. What are those words? There are 2 words for time in Greek. One begins with a K and one begins with a ch. What are they? Let's see how you get on. So, number 1, the band who sang Clocks were Coldplay. Well done if you got that. That's 1 point there. What time did Cinderella lose her glass slipper? Well, it was midnight. Well done if you got that right. Number 3, Psalm 81 reminds us what? That better is one day in your courts than 1,000 elsewhere. So if you wrote the word one day, you get yourself a point. Well done. Number 4. In Esther 4, Esther is reminded that she was born for such a time as this. That's the answer. Such a time as this. And our final question, the 2 words for time in Greek, are kairos time, and chronos time. Kairos time and chronos time. I wonder how you did. And I wonder if you have guessed what we're talking about today. That's right. Today we're going to be talking about time. We've all got time, but most of us feel like we don't. One of the things we hold in our hands is time. It's something that God gives us as a gift. And I'm going to read from Ecclesiastes chapter 3, that really well-known chapter on time. A time for everything. Ecclesiastes 3, verses 1 to 8. There is a time for everything and a season for every activity under the heavens. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to uproot. A time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather them, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to search and a time to give up, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be silent and a time to speak up, a time to love, and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. It's an amazing passage that begins with reminding us that time is a gift. God gives us the time and he gives us a season for everything. He gives us a season for everything. Remember, one of the questions talked about the fact that we have 2 types of time explained to us in the Bible. Firstly, we have chronos time, which is the time we think about often when we think about chronological time. We have a day, 24 hours, and it's made up of minutes and seconds. And you'll get up in the morning, you have your breakfast, you go to work, or do whatever it is that you do in your day. That's chronological time. We move from one thing to another. The minutes roll on into the hours, into the days. So it's the time that is laid out before us, the ticking time. This time is something that often we feel really short of. You go, how is it? The middle of August already, it was only just Christmas. We feel short of time. But that Bible verse has reminded us already that God has given us chronological time, and there is enough of it. He has given us a time for everything. I don't often feel like that, but actually it is reminding us again and again in the Bible that God has given us a time for everything. And he wants us to use that time well, that chronos time. Romans chapter 12 in the Message paraphrase says this. So here's what I want you to do. God helping you. Take your everyday, ordinary life, your sleeping, eating, going to work and walking around life, and place it before God as an offering. The time you have is a gift from God, and God wants you to use it as worship, as a way of honouring him and thanking him and using it for his glory. How do you invest your time? It's significant on how we use our time. Jesus used his time perfectly, surprise, surprise. He used it by spending time with his Father, developing his relationship with his Father through prayer and through study and through listening to what God had to say. He always had time for his Father. He also had time for his disciples, those that followed him around, that were part of his extended family, those that God had called to be with him. And he had time for them. He even made time in the busyness of ministry life to sit and eat and to discuss and learn and to laugh, I expect, a lot together. But he also had time for the crowds, for those who didn't know of God's love yet, who hadn't had the chance to be in his extended family. He always had the time for the woman who was bleeding, or the centurion who just lost his daughter, or time for the woman at the well. I often wonder whether I would have missed the woman at the well because I was rushing to the next meeting. Jesus always had time for people. How do I use my time like Jesus did? How do I use my chronos time? Do I spend time each day hanging out with my Father? Do I make extended space by using the Sabbath well to develop and rest in God's presence? Maybe this summer you want to go back over some of the Sabbath stuff that we have looked at earlier in the year. But do I spend each day and significant time each week building my relationship with the Father? That's one of the key things we need to be using our time for. But do I spend each week with other Christians as well? Some time encouraging them and letting them encourage me, praying for them, letting them pray for me. Jesus hung out with his disciples a lot over a meal. Do I eat together with others who I'm adventuring with Jesus? Do I serve others? Do I make time to serve God's family? By loving them, by being perhaps on a team at church, or by helping out in one way or another? How do I use my time to serve? And how do I use my time to share God's love? Do I do that at school, or at the school gate, or at work, or in the supermarket, or with my neighbours? Do I intentionally make time for those who need to hear of God's love? It's a real challenge. How do I use my chronos time, my everyday walking around, eating and sleeping life, as a living sacrifice to God? I hope you get a chance to think about that a little bit more this week. There is one more thing though, kairos time. You see, chronos time is about the way that we chronologically walk through life, but kairos time is a little bit more about what Ecclesiastes was talking about. A kairos time is a moment to be born and a moment to die. It's a life-changing moment. It's a moment almost where we stop and we recognise this is a significant moment, almost a deep moment, time standing still. For us, I was thinking about, I've got loads of Kairos moments, but one of them would be the birth of our first child, Lucy. We definitely have a BC, before child life, and a AC, after child life, because her being born was a moment in time where literally everything felt like it had changed. It was a significant moment. God uses these kind of times as well. He uses them in all kinds of ways, but here are a few. In these Kairos moments, he uses them to teach us about who he is. He uses those moments, even the really hard ones, especially the really hard ones, to show his presence and his power in our weakness. He uses those Kairos moments to help us grow, perhaps in relationships with other people. We might need to rely on them in a different way, or to ask for help, or to celebrate with them. A Kairos moment, though, also is a moment that God often teaches us stuff in about ourselves, and also might catch our attention about some changes that need to happen in us. And finally, these Kairos moments, these significant moments in time, often give us stories of God's love and his grace, or his forgiveness, or his power, or his healing, that we can share with others. I talked about BC and AC earlier, before children and after children. And Lucy was a bit of a traumatic birth, won't go there online, but it was not an easy one. And a few years later, I bumped into the midwife who delivered Lucy. And she said, "Oh, look at Lucy now. Isn't she amazing? She's a lot bigger." I often use your story when I'm teaching other midwives, because it was an unusual one. And I use the experience that you had to teach other midwives about what to do in those situations. Isn't that interesting? Slightly scary. Often, these Kairos moments, these significant moments, can be used for God's glory in all kinds of ways. By sharing something, by sharing my experience of what God did in those moments, or by sharing what I learned, or by sharing with those who aren't Christians about how faithful God was in them. These Kairos moments are significant. And God says to me, how are we going to use these Kairos times? How are we going to use these Kairos experiences to share other things about who God is? So God has given us Chronos time, but he's also given us Kairos time. And he asks us to remember that both of those are a gift. And he asks us, just like we talked about a couple of weeks ago in church when we were thinking about how we use the physical things that we have. He says to us, are you going to use the Kairos time and the Chronos time that I've given you gratefully? Always giving thanks for the new day that's ahead of us. Are you going to use it generously so that you can love others and use the time you have generously with other people? And are you going to use it gracefully? Perhaps sometimes it's sacrificially to myself. How am I going to use the time I have gracefully? Ecclesiastes 3, verse 1. There is a time for everything. Some of us need to know that. And there is a season for every activity under the heavens. I'm praying this week that you know that to be true, and that the time you have is used to spend time with God, to encourage others, serve others, and to share of his love in whatever way you can. Have a great week.